Hello, everybody. My name is Toni Runci, and I am an HR consultant with BlueLion. Today, we'll be discussing employee engagement, managing performance issues. I'm going to give a few minutes just to make sure everybody who has registered for this event has a chance to log in. I'm seeing just maybe a few more people on my list who are missing. If you cannot hear me or if you cannot see my screen, please let me know and I will change. You should be able to see the presentation that has the header that says employee engagement, managing performance issues with our logo on it. If you cannot see that, please let me know. Okay, looks like we've got everybody. So I'm going to begin. This presentation will be recorded. We'll be sending you a link to the recording after the presentation so that you have access to look back and review if you wanted to reflect on anything or you wanted to research something that we had shared. Our lovely legal has given us this wonderful disclaimer to remind everybody that this is educational purposes only. We are not giving any type of explicit legal advice. And if you have any questions about anything performance-wise that may result in termination or corrective action, so on and so forth, please obviously consult with legal if necessary, and we will discuss what that looks like as well during our presentation. So who are we? BlueLion is an HR consulting company. We are headquartered in New Hampshire and we service mostly New England, but we do actually communicate with about 13 separate states outside of New England. Most of them have a headquarter in one of our main states. But we are a team actually now of 12. So this photo does need to be updated. This was when we were a team clearly of 5. We have doubled in size in the last year. We specialize in providing quality HR support to all size businesses, but we really enjoy and work very well with blue collar companies. We are real people with real personalities, and we pledge 1% of our profit, our services, and our time to our community. So we're very invested in our own communities. We're all located mostly in New England, and then one of our team members is in New Jersey. And we do not oversell, so this is not a sales pitch to you. This is strictly a training to help you manage performance in-house. Obviously, if you did ever need support with managing performance issues, building a performance appraisal, dealing with employee issues, we can obviously support you in that aspect, but this is going to help you manage this yourself. And then if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A function, or to send an email to me after the fact, and we can definitely help you with anything based on this presentation. My name is Toni Runci, and I will be your presenter today. I have over 13 years HR experience. I have both a certification from SHRM and HRCI, and I am also a co-founder of BlueLion. So Allison Miliotto and myself started this business in 2018, and it has been fantastic. We worked with over 100 businesses since we've opened in the New England area, and we love just supporting our local community and dealing with all sorts of fun and crazy HR things. I'm sure people who are on this call are on the call because you've probably dealt with an HR performance issue and you want to maybe get a little bit more honed in on how to do that in a productive way. And we are going to help you with that process. So our overview today when we're dealing with managing performance is that it is most likely one of the most dreaded things that we think about. Recently, we were reading an article that shared something to the effect of we as people who are managing employees will deal with hours and hours and weeks of trying to avoid a conversation with an employee based on performance. When if you, as my business partner, Allison, would like to say, rip the Band-Aid off, you're dealing with maybe 36 hours of pain, whether it be managing the performance and it getting better or managing the performance and maybe letting the employee terminate from the organization. We sometimes linger this process because we don't want to deal with it. And the pain that it gives us throughout that time is much greater than if we just managed it in the beginning. So it's definitely dreaded by managers, by owners, and it's often dreaded sometimes by the employees if they don't know that it's coming or they do know that it's coming. Oftentimes they might have an underlying sense of what's going on, but either way, it's a difficult thing to manage. It's a difficult thing to be good at. And oftentimes it's not something we want to be good at because usually when we're dealing with performance issues, we're dealing with things that are not necessarily positive, but more on the negative side. So this training, we're going to discuss easy ways to communicate with your employees or easier ways. It's never perfectly easy to communicate with an employee and how to manage them with their issues, getting those positive goals and having that real talk with them. We all are, of course, are going to deal with certain employees that no matter how much we try and deal with their performance issues, have positive conversations, have that real talk, we're always going to deal with maybe that person 1 or 2 times in our career or 1 or 2 times in our week, depending on how large our businesses are. That no matter how often we deal with their performance, it's always going to be something that they don't necessarily reflect upon. So we do recognize that even if you do everything right, quote unquote, right, that there will still be difficult people who just maybe are never going to get on the level of what you need them to do. And that's when those conversations can shift from a performance management standpoint to maybe managing that person out of the organization. So we do like to put some fun memes and different cartoons inside of our presentation, because sometimes at the end of dealing with HR, at the end of your day, you sort of have to laugh, maybe drink a glass of wine, and realize that people are not necessarily always going to behave like adults, and reflecting that they should will sometimes give us more stress than we are looking forward to. So this is just a funny meme that we added in here. So here are a couple of strategies for dealing with tough conversations. The first one I sort of hit on in the very beginning, which is do not delay the conversation you are trying to have with that employee. Don't think to yourself, okay, if I don't talk about it now, it's going to go away or it'll get better. The employee is going to recognize that there's a situation. They might understand that I'm avoiding them because I don't want to talk to them about a performance issue. Procrastinating is the worst thing we can do for a couple different reasons. I always like to say managing performance is kind of like training an animal to use the bathroom. I know that sounds terrible to say, but if anybody has children that they're potty training, or if they've ever dealt with a dog or a cat that they tried to potty train, you can't get mad at your dog because a couple hours after they've gone to the bathroom on the carpet. They don't recognize the situation that you're trying to have a performance conversation with, right? Because the performance is you want your dog to go to the bathroom outside or notify you that they need to go to the bathroom. And when they don't, you can't, quote unquote, snap them on the nose or deal with them or scold them hours and hours after the situation. The correlation of time is very important. It works the same way with performance management. If you linger something 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, I've seen sometimes, and then you want to have that meeting because you were too busy or something popped up or there's a couple different things you can use as an example. When you decide to have the conversation with that employee, it's going to hit different for them. And the reason for that is they're going to say, well, that was 6 weeks ago, or I've been really great since then, or that was only one time. What about these other things that I've done really, really well? Sometimes conversations don't need to be this heavy, crazy burden of a discussion. Sometimes it can be as simple as, hey, Sarah, hey, Dave, thank you for giving me that presentation. You missed a couple things. I just wanted to reflect on so that next time when I give you this kind of project, you're able to hit it out of the park. I appreciate all the hard work you did. It definitely came through. There's a few things that moving forward, I want you to pay attention to. Doesn't need to be that serious. Doesn't need to be something that, is taking 30, 45 minutes of your time to discuss with the employee. It can be as easy as an email, a phone call with a follow-up email, whatever it looks like. So delaying the bigger things is usually where we try and focus. But if we've hit those smaller conversations of performance feedback, the bigger ones come a little bit easier to us, a little bit more naturally. The employee also reflects better on the bigger conversation if it's necessary because they recognize those smaller times where you've addressed issues that are positive and negative throughout their tenure and their time with the organization. So the only time I would say that you might need to delay a conversation to your advantage, as it says here, is if you or the employee needs to consult with a lawyer. So obviously providing protected leave, so on and so forth, might be really important, and you can delay it there. That is if you think that there's some kind of situation with an employee where, although it is performance related, maybe it'll reflect as retaliation because of the timeline to a complaint. Maybe they're in a protected working group and there's a situation that they've made comments in the past and you're worried that there might be some kind of correlation when there isn't. And so that is really the only time that a delay might be necessary. If you're just trying to check with legal counsel or a senior HR person to say, what is the goal here, then that would be the only time really to delay a conversation. But other than that, we should really be addressing things. If we can't address it within the same day, absolutely within the same week. Obviously, if something happens on a Friday and you can't address it on a Friday, addressing it within the next couple of days of the following week is definitely the goal. We want to avoid chit chat. We always, I think, want to make it easier and less awkward when we're dealing with difficult situations, difficult conversations. So sometimes when we come in, I think to ease ourselves, we say really that small talk at the beginning of the conversation. Hey, Sarah, how are things going? How are things with the kids? How are things with your husband? How are things with, Dave? How are things with your husband or your wife or whatever it might look like? And sometimes that can muddy the water. And the reason that I say don't necessarily have that chit chat is you want to get to the point. You don't want to delay the conversation, even in the conversation. The employee knows when they got called into your office that there's going to be something that's going to be discussed that needs to get better. So lingering it, trying to soften it is not always going to work for you. It also can give the mixed message that this is not necessarily that big of an issue, because it could appear with the icebreaker conversation or that small talk that the situation isn't as serious as it could be. So it muddies, again, those waters. You want to kind of avoid that, get straight to the point when the employee comes in. Hey, Sarah, listen, I know that this is uncomfortable for you. You probably maybe have expected that we were going to have this conversation. I want to address a couple of issues that we had recently about X, Y, and Z, and then hit those topics and hit those conversations as you go. Document it in writing. I always like to actually encourage people to document their information ahead of time. There's a couple reasons I say that. One, it makes you more prepared for the conversation. Sometimes when we have conversations with employees, they divert our attention to different things. They bring up different situations that we're not necessarily ready to discuss or we were not informed about prior to the meeting. So by having that email ahead of time, two things happen. One, it almost acts as an agenda for you to be able to reflect back on really quickly, take a look at it if it's on your computer screen, and say, okay, these are the points I'm trying to hit during this meeting. Two, it makes it a very quick follow-up with the employee of everything that was discussed, and it's easier for you to just add in those last few things that may have popped up during the meeting in real time. An email is a great way to document something. Not everything needs to be this formal written form on a corrective action sheet or anything like that. I always encourage, we've created, for example, in-house for us, something called an employee communication log. It's a simple white piece of paper. It says at the top, who did you talk to? When did you talk to them? And now because everything's remote or if we're meeting somewhere, where, so you can remember, was it virtual? Was it in person? Was it over the phone? And what did we talk about? And then at the bottom, was there any action items? And simple and easy, you can type it into the electronic, I can handwrite it if I'm in a meeting with them in person, and I can plop it right into their employee file. So it's a great way to have a quick follow-up. It doesn't need to be something super formal, and everything can kind of come out at the end. The employee can reflect on it and it looks good. So that's a great way to look back and have that review when it comes to those emails after the fact. So having that is a great way to document that information. So be prepared. The two documents before the meeting with the employee, have that information. The first lists the talking points, like I said, for you. The second is the review for the employee. And then you can follow up with any action items after the fact. Here's another fun meme. Anybody who doesn't know Mr. T, he pities the fool who doesn't have frequent check-ins. So you should be having pretty consistent check-ins with your employees, maybe not necessarily daily, but maybe weekly, bi-weekly. And again, it doesn't need to be crazy formal. It can be as simple as, hey, how's it going? What's going on? Or following with emails based on projects that we've worked on together or that they've delivered on. If you have any kind of internal CRM model, you can communicate with them through that. But they definitely should be frequent. And the reason for that is you want the employee to feel comfortable even when you're addressing a negative performance issue. So if you are giving them positive and negative feedback, corrective course actions throughout their tenure, weeks, months, years with you, then when you do address something more heavy, they're ready to recognize, oh, okay, this is something that I was expecting to have a conversation about, or I'm comfortable following up with my manager, or I don't feel really heavy when I'm getting called in, quote unquote, to the principal's office or to a Zoom meeting. Especially now, it's a little bit harder for us to manage performance. if we've all gone remote. You know, if an employee isn't normally meeting with you and all of a sudden a Zoom pops up on their calendar, they might obviously feel a little bit uneasy about what this conversation might look like. So when you have those more frequent check-ins, it eases the employee, it eases you, and it makes those conversations to the point. More frequent is definitely the way to go. Don't wait for performance to be addressed at the annual review or their 6-month review that you're looking back on that performance issue, which should have been handled right away. The next thing is to always provide examples. And this is the other reason to utilize that same email that we're working on before we have our meeting. And the reason for that is you want to hit on specifics. And the reason I always say this is because a lot of times what we want to do is we want to address somebody based on maybe something that's behavioral. And when we're saying, oh, you know, Bill comes in and he's always in a bad mood, Bill gives everybody a bad mood, blah, 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 blah. Well, what does that mean? You need to have real examples. Okay, wow, when Bill comes in, he slams his cup around in the kitchen and then he grumbles a lot. He's very rude to the other team members when they ask him how his day is. He says negative things like X, Y, and Z. You always want to be able to provide very clear examples. So when you're trying to course correct, you can provide clear examples of what that looks like. Hey, Bill, maybe Bill's not a morning person. It's like, all right, Bill, if your morning looks like you crashing around the company kitchen, maybe wait a couple minutes or bring your coffee from home or recognize that other people are perceiving you in this fashion, so on and so forth. And by providing a number of specific behavioral examples, you can show a pattern or a history. Behavior is a lot harder to correct than something specific and tangible like, you know, you missed a deadline or you misspelled something or the client ended up getting something completely outside of the scope of their work. Behavior is often what we really need to be focusing on, and it's difficult because it's a lot about perception of the person giving the corrective action and about the person receiving the corrective action. So when you have a lot more examples versus those one-offs, you can definitely look at the pattern history of how the employee is behaving as a whole. You want to avoid focusing on intent. So you may be disappointed or even angry at the employee. Intent is largely irrelevant. You can't prove it. So you can't say, wow, Bob, you're in here and you're trying to make all the other employees uncomfortable. You don't know what Bob's trying to do. Bob maybe is just, like I said, not a morning person. You also want to be careful about the way we quote unquote scold employees. I've heard some pretty interesting things sometimes, and I think we approach things in an emotional way. For example, by saying something to the point of, Bob, I was really disappointed in how you presented something. By attaching an emotional response that you have to somebody else's emotional response, it's an escalation of how we each feel, and you can't control how people feel. I always say it's also something you shouldn't try and do, and it's never something that you can do. It's not something legally that we can work on. People have different feelings for different reasons. You have different feelings for different reasons. So focusing on intent is never going to get you the result that you're looking for. It's never going to get you the return on your investment when you've had those conversations on performance. So having that kind of language and conversation is not helpful to you. So obviously focusing on the very specifics, it goes back to the examples and it keeps things in perspective. It also helps when an employee goes to the next section, which is staying away from the why. Why employees behave a certain way or performance issues happen can be a little bit dicey and can get into different areas of protected classes, such as Americans with Disabilities Act, or they can share other information with you medically. So if we're asking, you know, wow, Dave, every single day that you come into work, you're walking around, you're being rude and disrespectful to team members, you're telling them that you don't want to be here, what's going on, what happens? Our instinct is to ask what's going on, but instead we should always start with, this is inappropriate behavior, it's unprofessional. Do you understand that? This is what we're looking for moving forward. Oftentimes, whether we like it or not, the employee is going to get into the why. They're going to tell you some kind of a story. Well, I'm not feeling well, or my dog was sick last night, my child didn't sleep, my wife and I are fighting, my husband and I are fighting, my mom is sick, my car broke down, my house just needed repairs, I don't have enough money for the bank, like whatever it is. I'm sure we've heard a million things. And I understand how difficult it is to separate work and home. We're at work for one half of our waking time, one third of our lives. And to focus on that and pretend like it can be a whole separate issue is very difficult and unlikely. But we always want to reflect on the fact that when you're at work, there's certain expectations that need to be had. And if for some reason you cannot meet those expectations, let's see what we can do to either accommodate you if it's a situation that requires a leave of absence, if it's a situation that requires maybe another kind of an accommodation, coming into work late, leaving early, having more remote work, whatever it looks like. Good employers want to work with good employees, but you want to be careful about what kind of situation you're getting yourself into when it comes to accommodations, because it does play well into the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you don't want to come up against something that could be viewed as discriminatory in nature. So being careful about inquiring or speculating. I've heard people say things to the effect of, I know a lot's going on at home, or I know that you're dealing with issues with your child, or the scariest thing I've heard people say is, I know in the past you've had issues maybe with alcohol or drug misuse, and now you're completely opening yourself up to all kinds of different possibilities for discrimination, harassment, as well as dealing with that performance when it comes, again, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So never assume why an employee is not performing well. Always focus on the performance, focus on the exact examples, make sure you're very careful with the language that you're using. That's why it's so important to have that email or that document drafted ahead of time to help keep you on point and to help keep the employee on point. Employees, when they're getting performance communications, try and divert attention. Just like anybody else who doesn't want to have anything reflected on them poorly, they want to point out the why and sometimes don't take personal responsibility for these items, and that can be frustrating. If they try and go on a tangent outside of what's happening, you can be kind and still bring the conversation back to what's at hand. You can say, I'm really sorry that's happening. I understand how that can bring stress. We can talk about how we can offer some different accommodations or meet some of your needs, but we still need you to hit X, Y, and Z. So you're still being open, you're still listening, you should still care. Obviously, what's happening in an employee's personal life is going to affect their work life. But at the end of the day, if you need them to be hitting deadlines, meeting expectations, that's really going to be what happens in the conversations when you're meeting with them on performance. Following up with those emails is super, super important. Performance also ties into your annual reviews. So when we have those more frequent check-ins, when we're communicating with our employees more frequently on a week-to-week, a bi-weekly, a monthly basis, we're able to share that information with them, and it gives us a pattern and history of communication that we can go out to at the end of that conversation. So here's your performance review, Tina, and you were saying, I focused on your performance for the past 2 weeks because I don't remember anything further back. This happens all the time, and it happens for a lot of different reasons. We're not having frequent communication with our team members. So when we have to look back at a 12-month timeline, we think to ourselves, oh God, I can't even remember all the things Tina worked on. And I can't remember all the things I've assigned to Tina. Was she meeting deadlines? Was she not meeting deadlines? There was that one time, I can't remember what she did for that. And so you lose the value of what these are for. And it creates problems if you need to terminate an employee, or if you want to promote an employee and show what they're doing for their A+ hires. So don't treat performance as an afterthought, because everything does end up leading to your annual reviews if you're doing them, which I hope you're at least doing them annually, if not more frequently. And having those conversations is super important. So I love these little cartoons. They're one of the few that go really well HR cartoons, which I really like. So you'll actually see another one of them throughout the presentation. Make no excuses. So no employee is perfect, and sometimes an employee's failings are due to those of the organization. And don't take responsibility unless you are truthfully responsible. Sometimes when we're doing performance management, we learn things that we might not have known. And the reason for that is depending on how large your team is, you can't be everywhere all the time. So there might be things that are not necessarily brought to your attention. You yourself are oftentimes working managers, working owners. So when we're having a conversation on performance with an employee, they might bring something up that doesn't really make sense to us or that we didn't know ahead of time. So be careful when the employee is bringing things up that might be an organizational downfall. If it truthfully is something that is operation, like, oh, wow, we thought this was an employee issue, and it turns out that we aren't providing the necessary structure they need to succeed, or I didn't recognize that they were doing X, Y, and Z, feel free to correct it. For example, I was working in an organization once. Everybody was remote. We had a team member who was taking almost 3 times as long to complete this particular project that was reoccurring for our clients every single time she touched it. We didn't know what was going on. We thought it was her. We wanted to have a conversation. When we had the conversation with her, she shared that her systems were not up and running. She goes, oh, well, I have trouble when I'm doing this in the system. We realized that when IT had set her up, they had missed a whole portion of her onboarding and they didn't give her the right system that she needed. So she was manually making some of these changes and she had no idea that it should be done differently. We completely revamped what we were doing, gave her the updated stuff, and she was right on target with those deadlines. So sometimes we go in and we think we have all the facts, and it's okay. We're working quickly. There's even managers are not going to be perfect, and we have our own performance to focus on. But recognize that there are things sometimes that need to be adjusted on the employer end. But again, be careful about taking responsibility unless you truthfully are responsible. So if you're a manager and there's performance and you recognize you maybe weren't providing the right lead time, you weren't providing the right support, it's okay to say, listen, I know I wasn't providing the right support, but I gave you additional resources that you could have reached out to. So being careful and not making excuses for poor performance is a really big thing that sometimes we try and pacify and alleviate some of that stress. Careful what you say, because it obviously can come back in the future if we're trying to terminate or if the employee feels discriminated against. Watch for code words. So before having those difficult conversations, you need to make sure that you don't, that you're not biased on the language that you have. And this is something I see a lot of times as a woman when we're trying to address issues with women. So I've used the word a couple of times here about emotions. Men and women have emotions, but I often hear when I'm dealing with different companies and different kinds of people that they say, she is very emotional. He's very emotional too, actually, but when he's dealing emotionally, he yells. Well, that's an emotion. Anger is an emotion. She gets sad and maybe she cries. That's her way of dealing with it. Working with our performance and working with the different emotions is something that we need to be careful of, and watching for that language that we're using for both genders or non-binary gender, whatever it may be. We need to be paying attention to things that you don't realize may be viewed as a biased language. So having those things written down, sticking to the very specific topic we're talking about, sticking to those very specific examples that we're talking about will help reduce some of that stress. Even with legitimate complaints, sometimes employees use words that may hint at discrimination. It's not necessarily intent that you say these things or that somebody else brings these things to your attention, but it exists. We had, for example, a company that brought an issue with us where one of the employees, this is no joke, one of the employees came with a complaint that his office mate smelled like mothballs. Well, we come to find out that this employee has actually had several issues with other employees who were older than 40, let's say. They were above the threshold of age discrimination. And his feedback always seemed to be very unique with how he would bring up issues with them. So when he brought up the fact that this employee smelled like mothballs, we started looking at the pattern of history. His complaints actually were not rooted in the fact that he had issues with him. He was unhappy with the fact that this person wasn't tutoring him the way he wanted. It became a whole nother situation during the investigation. But you think to yourself, like, oh, that's mothballs. You got to be careful. Like, that's something that can be used as like you're basically making somebody who's older a claim against them because they're old. Realistically, why? Because in his mind, mothballs relate to an age situation. So being careful about that can absolutely bring discrimination. I'm sure many people who are maybe on this call have had performance brought up with them, or you've sat in a performance management with another person and they've said things and you've just held your tongue and maybe blinked back, shock. So being careful about that is really important. And that's why having it written down to follow that script will help keep you out of trouble. Avoid absolutes. So this is a huge one. Saying things like always or never, you always show up to work late. You're never delivering projects on time. Don't say things like that. If they're not delivering projects on time, instead of saying you never deliver projects on time, say, hey, Sarah, here's the last 6 projects we assigned to you. None of these were delivered on time. These were the due dates. These are the dates that they were delivered. All of them were passed. They're specific in nature. If you have those specifics, focus on those specifics versus using the absolute language. And the reason for that is people are always going to combat always and nevers. And I said always because it's true. Think about your significant other, think about a parent, think about your children. Anytime you use that language, they generally say, oh, always, I always do that. What about X, Y, and Z? And now you're getting into a tit for tat kind of situation, going back and forth, and no one has time or energy for that. And it's not productive for you, it's not productive for them. So avoiding those always and nevers, absolutes are easy. Because they're, as it says here, they're undefendable. So you can't necessarily hold that statement to be true. I always like to think about the fact of in the court of law, when you're in HR, you have to think about what happens if this becomes discoverable? What happens if this gets brought up in a court of law? You want to be careful with how you're documenting language on written paper, the conversations you're having that could become discoverable, because everything will come to light. So if you're using language like always, or you're using language like never, and then something happens, it's found to be discriminatory, you're going to end up having issues. We recently just helped a client who was dealing with an employee who made a claim against pregnancy discrimination. She was unhappy because she wasn't being promoted. Well, she wasn't being promoted because the company had a very clear promotion structure based on education, credentials, years of experience, the whole thing. She had taken specific time off for pregnancy, which was totally fine. When she came back, they were trying to accelerate her path by getting her the additional training that she missed. She wasn't feeling like she was getting supported well enough. Her manager was giving poor performance feedback. And what ended up happening was she felt like she was being discriminated against. The investigation showed that that wasn't true, but it's still a taste in that employee's mouth that there's a situation here that's unfair to them. And now it puts a taste in the manager's mouth that they can't trust the employee to trust them. So being careful with our language is very, very important. I say things to the effect of, we communicate, but not to understand, and we listen, but only to respond. It's not a quote I came up with, but it's something that was said to me once, and it's very true. We're usually listening so that we can reflect. We're not always listening so that we can understand and say, okay, that makes sense. How would I feel? How would I respond? How will I now respond? So focusing on that when we're thinking about those code words, the excuses, and avoiding those absolutes. So here's another really fun one for me. ASOC, your work has been excellent all year. I'm rating you poor though, so that I'll have a paper trail in case I ever need to fire you. You'll probably feel a little surge of motivation because you got feedback. So just as important as it is to document the bad information and the bad kind of performance or poor performance, you want to document good performance. And you don't want to give employees this mixed messaging on a review. If an employee is doing good, tell them that they're doing good. If they're not doing well, tell them areas to improve upon. But absolutely, you need to document what is true. Because if you are giving performance feedback or no feedback at all, which is even worse. So you're giving no feedback, and then when you do give feedback, you're missing the areas of improvement. You're only hitting on the good stuff. All of a sudden, when that pattern of performance comes up and a termination may be the only result because we've started a performance improvement plan, so on and so forth, if you don't have documentation, you're going to have a real difficult time. A great example of this is we recently were helping a client. An employee wanted to, a manager wanted to terminate one of their employees. They came forward, they said, he's a problem. He's been a problem for however many months. We've had issues with him, X, Y, and Z. It's the first time that was brought to our attention. So we were like, wow, these are really significant claims that you're making. We looked into it. We pulled his performance review that had happened 6 months prior to this conversation. It read like this employee was about to become CEO. He was the most influential employee at work. He was so positive. He took on extra tasks. He was the greatest. He was an A+ player. when we asked the manager why he rated his employee like this, he said, well, it's difficult for me to give the difficult feedback. It's difficult for me to terminate somebody who has no idea what's going on. It's difficult for anybody to terminate somebody who has no idea what's going on. It's difficult for us to manage that situation. So I remember when my team member brought that up to me, she's like, I was ready to go and terminate. I pulled that performance review. It read like he was an A+ player. And I just put my head in my hands like, what am I supposed to do with this? Luckily, she was able to go back and say, okay, listen, we're going to go on a performance improvement plan. We're going to have these conversations. We can't let this go by. We can't terminate somebody who thinks he's doing phenomenally because you don't want to have that difficult conversation. So having positive feedback, having negative feedback, making sure it's honest is super important. And not all feedback, as we see here, is going to create motivation like ASOC thinks is going to happen. Additional strategies is to listen. So when you give the employee the opportunity to talk, sometimes, as I've shared with the other aspect, is they'll share things with you that make you recognize, oh, okay, this might not necessarily be an employee issue. Maybe it's a process issue, or okay, I didn't recognize this was something that they were struggling with. They need additional resources. It's also important to listen so that the employee feels like their feedback is heard, but there is a point that you need to kind of shut it down. And I say this because if you anticipate a quick conversation of 30 minutes, and it's happened to me, and sometimes you just have people who will go on, and all of a sudden you're addressing performance, and then they go off on a 10, 15-minute tangent for every example that you have. Now your 30-minute conversation is an hour-and-a-half conversation, and you don't necessarily feel like the employee has understood exactly what you're telling them or what you're hoping the end result and goal is going to be. That is a problem. So you want to listen, you want to gather their feedback, you want them to be heard, but at the end of the day, you still want those expectations, which is the next bullet, to be clearly defined. You want to say, here's our problem. I heard what you're saying. I'm going to take your feedback. If there's feedback that needs additional action items or results, and I'm going to look into them, or I'm going to follow up with X, Y, and Z. But these are our expectations moving forward. I need you to come to work on time. I need you to deliver projects when they are due. I need you to follow up with the necessary parties when they reach out to you, whatever that might look like. And setting those objectives is so important upon them leaving the meeting. And setting those objectives and following up with that email is just as important. When an employee leaves, sometimes it's like a shock to them, and they leave and then they forget some of the conversation that you had. And then if you schedule a follow-up appointment 30 days from now, they might come in and say, well, that's not what I understood last time we met. Well, that's not what we discussed last time we met. So following up with that email and saying, hey, Bill, hey, Sarah, hey, whoever, here's what we discussed today. Here's what the result of this conversation was. Here's what I'm looking for in the next 30 days. Let me know if you misunderstood anything or if you think I'm missing anything. That gives the employee the opportunity to say, yes, I agree that this is everything we talked about. No, there's nothing missing. Or, yep, we talked about this too. How do you want me to handle? And it closes that gap of what we're looking for and having that employee meet that expectation. So it's really important to have those clearly defined expectations moving forward and making sure they're tangible. You can't just make the statement of, I want you to come into work every day and be happy. That's an unrealistic expectation. It's also not one that's legitimate to the organization generally, but you can set expectations of, when you come into work, I would like you to be more polite to the people in the office and not necessarily cuss them out, or I don't want you banging around in the kitchen in the morning, so on and so forth. Specific actionable items are clear to define. So when we're dealing with performance, these are the things that we want to remember. It's uncomfortable for you. It's just as uncomfortable for them. But if you address it, it's a lot easier to do right off the bat and have that conversation. So conquer your fears, rip the Band-Aid off, put it on the calendar, schedule the appointment, and have the conversation. If you need a little help, you can reach out to us, reach out to somebody internally to your organization, reach out to another person who's maybe at the same level as you organizationally at another organization, work your network to have the support that you're looking for. Do your homework. If a manager brings something to you or an employee brings something to you that's a complaint that needs to be addressed, don't just take them on their word. Look into it, see if it's true. Sometimes maybe it's a misunderstanding, sometimes it's misperception, but making sure that we have all of our ducks in a row before we go into that meeting is very important so that you're not blindsided or you recognize you're addressing an issue that is not necessarily the issue with that particular person. Also, it helps when you're dealing with people who might make a complaint that might be organization-wide. So if so-and-so is doing something and the manager wants it addressed, I always say to them, are they the only person in this department that's doing that? Are they the only person who you're having issues with? Because if they're not, but they're the only one that you're asking me to address the issue with, then we have a bigger problem. We need to treat everybody, not necessarily equally, because different people need to be treated in an appropriate manner, but we need to be addressing all the issues equally as they necessarily need to be addressed. Finding the right setting. So making sure, I know it's a little bit harder post-COVID. Everybody is remote generally, but if it's in an office, making sure that it's in a private area that other people are not necessarily able to hear or see. If it's virtual, making sure that you're letting the employee know ahead of time, okay, we're going to have a virtual conversation about performance, and making sure that that setting makes sense to the conversation we're about to have. Be positive and leave your emotions at the door. I know when I say that it's difficult when you think be positive when I'm having a conversation about performance is difficult. When I say be positive, I mean, don't come in with this heavy hand and aggressive nature and aggressive tone of, dropping the hammer. I've had so many managers say, well, I need to have a come to Jesus conversation, or I'm going to drop the hammer. Going in with that personality, going in with that initial intent, going in with that attitude is not going to reap reward with the employee when they can tell that you're coming in for that particular emotion. And emotion is gender across the board, doesn't matter. Anybody can go in with that kind of attitude. It's not going to work out well for you. The employee can read that generally. They will try and match that attitude at times. And then again, it's going to result in not a positive result if we're looking for the employee to stay with us, get better, and improve on that performance. Be consistent. If you're dealing with this with one employee, deal with it similarly across the board unless there's extenuating circumstances like an ABA situation. Don't decide, okay, I don't like Dave, so I'm going to hit Dave for these particular things. If Sarah, Karen, and Bob are all doing the same things, but you like Sarah, Karen, and Bob, you need to be consistent with performance reviews. You need to be consistent with managing performance. If everyone's doing something incorrectly, everyone needs to be shared. With caution, I say this: never send a performance email to a group to address a group situation. And here's why. If you've ever received an email that says, for example, we're having issues with employees doing X, Y, and Z, please be conscientious and don't do it anymore. Very rarely, even if it may be you, are you thinking, this email is about me. Most of the time you're thinking, oh, this email is about Karen, this email is about Susan, Bill, Joe, and you're thinking about that. And here's the thing, maybe it is about Susan, Bill, Karen, and Joe. But do you think Susan, Karen, Bill, and Joe are thinking about that email as it being about them? They're not. Address performance one-on-one. Don't address performance in a group. Be consistent with that. Even if everyone's getting the same kind of communication, do it on an individual one-to-one basis. Keep the performance confidential. That's important. You want to obviously create the trust between the employee, the manager at the company, whatever it may be. So making sure you're not then going around and saying, oh, I gave so-and-so a corrective action. Oh, I wrote so-and-so up. If somebody has made a complaint against that person, you did the investigation and now you need to follow up with them, you can follow up with that person and say, listen, thank you for bringing that complaint to me. We did do an investigation. We found some information that did require action and we took the action required. If this continues, please let us know, bring it to our attention. That doesn't give that employee the right to know this is what happened. I gave Dave a write-up, so on and so forth. You need to know you trusted me to do the research. I did it. You trusted me to follow up. I did it. If there's further action, I will continue to do it. And that's because you don't want employees to know each other's performance issues, and you don't want them to then go back and make it an issue that they start gossiping or turns into harassment. And if it does, you need to performance review and manage that as well. And then loop back to review the situation. If it's something that is consistently occurring and you want to do a 30-day check-in, a 2-week check-in, tell them they're doing well or that they still need to kind of hit a certain target. If they're doing well, you can say, hey, you really took my feedback. I'm seeing some great improvements. I'm seeing you X, Y, and Z. These are the things I was looking for. Positive reinforcement is always going to result with a better opportunity for them to get better at what you're asking them to do versus negative reinforcement, but both need to happen appropriately in those timelines. That is the presentation on how to manage performance issues. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. I do not believe I turned on a Q&A for this particular presentation. So if you do have questions, please throw it into the chat function. I did turn on Q&A, so you can very easily enter your questions there. Everything will come confidentially to me, so I'll be able to manage those questions. I will give everyone a couple of minutes, or really just a couple of seconds actually. Most minutes, the typing can happen pretty quickly. Okay, great. Looks like I don't have any major questions. So I either did a really good job or I put every single person on this to sleep. Either way, I hope that the presentation you can watch again and reflect back on what needs to happen. If you do want support or have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We do post a lot of information to people. So we post blogs that are free to you that have information on how to deal with performance, and all sorts of other kinds of things that are helpful. If you're a one-person show managing HR in your organization, please follow us on social media. We share a lot of free resources and advice there. So if you're trying to run things in-house and you just need a little extra support, we are here to help with that. If you do need some more actual support, please feel free to email us at info@bluelionllc.com, and we'll help you in any way that we can. We appreciate you joining our webinar today. We do have free webinars every single month. So if you visit our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter and you can get informed about those pretty regularly, and follow us, and we'll be able to continue to educate you on all the fun things that are HR so that you and your team can be just as professional, productive, and effective as we try and help you be. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and you have a fantastic rest of your week.